Hi, everyone. This is Andrew,
And this is Laura.
and you are listening to Sunday School Dropouts.
This is our first episode today. So, we are going to take a little bit of time to introduce ourselves and then we're going to talk about religious trauma. But before that, we are going to have some flannelgraph story time. All right. Flannelgraph story time is going to be an opportunity for us to share with you what we are reading and listening to, what's important or influencing us right now. Andrew, what you reading?
Oh, what am I not reading? I have so many bookmarks and so many books. Actually, one thing I'm reading right now. This is going to sound completely unrelated to any and everything religious trauma, but that's cool. A Natural History of North American Trees
Very interesting.
by Donald Kohlroas PD. Yeah, it's I've always liked trees, and I've always and the way he writes is it's like not like a science textbook. It's very much a narrative and kind of like the history of these trees and the roles that they played throughout history in this country. So it's just really
Mhm.
interesting. And it's nice because it's not psychology or religious trauma related. I feel like I spend so much
Yeah.
time in that world that it's kind of nice to read something that actually has nothing to do with it. It's kind of just a random topic, but it's something that I've kind of interested in. So yeah.
Yeah. I love that because I agree with you that when you're in it every day, you need those like moments for like take a breath and not have to be thinking all the time about trauma,
Yeah.
religious
Yeah.
trauma, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It gets heavy. I mean,
it
that
does.
being such, like it's an important topic, but like,
Mhm.
compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, all the things they tell you about in grad school, like that stuff's
Yeah.
real.
Yeah, I supervise other therapists who are in the process of getting their licenses and they'll regularly say to me like, "Oh, I don't have time to read all these books and whatever, there's all these things I want to learn." And I remember thinking like, I don't know if other professions do this, but of course you and I, like we're both in the therapeutic world, we have degrees in that, but I'm wondering like if other professions actually like go home and read more about their profession like so they can go the next day and be a better accountant. Like I don't know, does an accountant go and read books on accounting when they get home? I don't know, but therapists tend to read therapy books when they go home. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I kind of doubt it, but I mean, I could
yeah.
be wrong. Any CPAs out there care to correct me? Go for it.
Exactly.
Maybe that's a thing. Maybe they go home and they're reading
Exactly.
accounting books
Yeah.
before they go to sleep at night.
Sounds fascinating. Yeah. I don't know if
Yeah.
that'll make an appearance on my flannel graph story time ever. CPA books. I love
So,
it.
anything you're currently reading?
Yeah, I'm similar to you in that I give myself breaks from therapy stuff. And so the book that I was thinking of is a little bit actually related to religious trauma, but in a weird sort of way. It's actually called What the Fresh Hell Is This by a woman. I think she identifies female. I'm not sure actually. So by an individual named Heather Corinna. And it's actually about perimenopause and menopause because full disclosure, like I've had some medical things going on this year and has caused a lot of hormonal changes. But what I've been realizing through that actually has to do with religious trauma because of the way that like suffering and pain was talked about, like the glory of suffering and how
Mm,
you just silence yourself and you just grind through things, which is, I know, also part of like capitalism. But I feel
yeah.
like as it pertains to religion, there's just been such a de-emphasis of the body and not listening and these sorts of things. And so as I've undergone some different medical things and bodily changes just as you age, it's been really interesting to dig into some of this work, like just as it pertains to like my own body. And I feel like I'm learning things that I probably should have learned a long time ago, but just never had the opportunity to. So I have like 7 books on like this topic, which is
Yeah.
it's that's like very me. Like I want to know all the research and then I can like share with other people. So I read that and then I read some like trashy romance novels too. And it's not because I like them, but I just, try to cleanse my mind of deeper stuff. But yeah,
It's a
that's
palate
like what
cleanser.
I'm reading. It is. It's totally a palate cleanser because it's mindless. That's why I watch reality TV is it's like so mindless. But that's kind of like what I'm reading into like what I'm watching also is like trashy reality TV. Because you need those mind palate cleansers. Otherwise this is heavy work.
Yeah, I could go down a whole rabbit trail. It's like there's so much,
Yeah.
so much there. Like, like really,
Yeah.
like with like menopause and purity culture and patriarchy, just all the
Yeah.
programming that comes out of fundamentalist Christianity relating to
Mhm.
bodies, especially
Yeah.
women's bodies. And anyway, not trying to derail this segment to go down a whole other thing, but it's just it is a lot, so much. So
yeah, I've learned that even more, that like the further into my own healing I get, you kind of start to see the remnants of all these systems that we've been a part of and like where the gaps are in regard to like information that we need to know or ways to become embodied and how that really shifts everything in our lives. So it's been a very interesting last few months because of all of this. Like it's like a new layer that's being kind of worked on. I kind of like it. Cool. Well, anything else that you want to share for story time?
Why not? Because there is something that I'm listening to get out of the blue this week, and it's nothing new and groundbreaking. So I don't know. Are you familiar with, or have you heard of the band Sum 41?
Yes, I have heard of them. Yes.
One of my high school bands, kind of a punk rock style band from Canada. They've been around for 27 years. They just announced this week, though, that they are disbanding after 27 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
I mean, I think it's on good terms. They're still going to release, there's one more studio album they're releasing. They're on tour right now, and then they're going to do a final tour for the last album in the next couple of years. But they are along with some other bands, are one of the bands that me personally really listened to and found a lot of meaning in back in high school, which, for those who don't know, I went to a Seventh-day Adventist academy. So it was very fundamentalist Christian high school where, bands like Sum 41 were not allowed to be listened to. Yes. So I did that on my own time off campus, of course. But yeah, they were one of the bands that really had a lot of meaning for me. And so I've just been sort of re-listening to a lot of their older albums, especially the ones I listened to back then recently. And cool side note to that, they are still going on tour as we speak. And later this summer, they're going to be not too far from me in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Oh, nice.
And I just mentioned online, I think on Instagram, about, if someone wants to buy me tickets to these, I'll be forever grateful. And I actually had a follower Venmo me money for 2 tickets.
Oh my gosh, that is so amazing.
Yeah. I love it. I will make sure I do indeed get those tickets, and I will make sure that I see Sum 41 later this summer in Charlotte. So
I love that.
Thank you to who did that. He knows who he is. I won't name drop him, of course, but I appreciate you.
That's really cool. I'm so curious, like, do you now, like, being at the place in your life that you're at now and looking back on like those high school experiences and what the band meant to you then, like, do you listen to their music differently now? Do you get something different? Does it bring you back to your middle school self? Like, how does that work for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I've seen that evolution in my life. There was a time when I would listen to it and it took me back, but not in a good way. Because there was a lot of really heavy stuff happening in my life at that time. And so, and this was at a time in my life where I really hadn't processed it in the sense of having healed from it. Not that you ever linearly heal from it, like it doesn't, but I hadn't done any of the work. I hadn't done therapy. I was not yet a therapist, so I hadn't done training. So there was like kind of like a gap where that was what the experience was like. Now when I listen to it, like I like it. It's nostalgic. It's cool. Like, I don't know. There's still like the heavy, painful stuff, but there's honestly a lot of the joy as well. Like, and it's really just kind of like there's room for both. And I have done a lot of my own trauma work. So I'm not going to say that it doesn't carry baggage with it. It does to a certain extent, but there's still like so much good connected to it that I'm here for it, So like, I love those guys. They meant a lot to me at a dark time in my life. And, I'm well beyond that now, but I still find value in their music and what they meant to me and what they meant to my younger self. That's another piece. Like, there is definitely a younger version of me that absolutely adores these guys. And so it's kind of like, there's also just leaning into and letting that part of me exist too, rather than shaming that part. Like, oh, what the fuck, Andrew, you should be beyond this now. That was like 20 years ago or whatever.
Yeah. It's like a lifeline almost, you know, that
Mhm.
was like so
Yeah.
important for you. It's so incredible how music does that, you know, music
Oh yeah.
has that impact on us. And, you know, I've thought about that a lot too in my own life, just like how music can impact for good or maybe not, you know, or but also like where it brings you to. You hear that song, that riff, that, you know,
Yeah.
whatever, and all of a sudden you're back there wherever it is, and it's like this embodied experience. It brings about something like physiologically in you that connects you to different people and places and space and time,
Yeah.
which is pretty incredible, and then sometimes hard, like you're saying, you know, all of a
Yeah.
sudden I can remember those things with more vividness now, which isn't always fun.
Oh yeah. Well, for instance, like I'll still like randomly hear a song from like late 1990s era Jackie Velasquez, and I'll literally
Oh
feel
yeah.
I'll feel nauseous. Sorry, Jackie. It's nothing personal, I promise, but it's just the memories of life as it was when
Yeah.
I was hearing those songs. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's that those
Yeah.
are songs that, yeah, I don't listen to those anymore. I don't really
Yeah.
want to go back to those. I don't. So
Yeah. I know I actually for a long time had to take a pretty significant break from all music. Not even just like Christian music, but I recognize how music it really can shift things for us in some really beautiful ways too. I had a friend who did a dissertation on the experience of like going to concerts like with other people. Like what does that do to your body physiologically as well as like on a community level, and how you feel connected. And music is so powerful. And so whenever I was at certain points in my own process of deconstructing, I had to back up from music altogether because of how deeply that music had impacted me, and not wanting to be impacted like that again, like on such a deep level, that I was like, music is too much for me at this point. And it was like almost overstimulating to my system. And I was so scared that I would be sucked back into, you know, some
mhm.
other way of thinking or believing, because I didn't feel like I was strong enough at that point to be able to figure things out. I don't know, but I've really missed it. And so in the last several years, I've been able to kind of get back into it. And I'm a big fan of like 90s music. And so there's so much joy then that comes up, because even though I had to like listen to it in secret back then, now it's just, you know, it's so wonderful. Like 1997 was a great year for music. Let's just put that out there.
Oh, that's so funny you say that. That's so funny. Yes, I was the same way. I wasn't allowed to
Yeah.
listen to a lot of these things, but I literally
Yeah.
have a playlist right now that's called 1990 Summer, full of like
Nice.
Smashing Pumpkins and Third Eye Blind and all the stuff that was like top hits, 25 years ago.
Yes. I love it. Next episode, when we're doing this segment, I'll probably be like talking about your playlist. So anyways, I love that. Well, thank you. I'm appreciative of sharing that. I think it's always so fun to like share things like this, you know, lets people know a little bit of who we are. But
Yeah.
I'm always inspired by what other people are reading and listening to and watching. Gives me good ideas.
Yeah.
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 So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to our prayer requests segment. And if you are familiar at all with how prayer requests work in the church, it is not really prayer requests. It is our way to spread gossip in a holy manner. So that is what we are going to be doing. Welcome to prayer requests. And I think our first topic of discussion is the newly released documentary on Amazon Prime, Shiny Happy People, that is talking about the Duggars with the IBLP, so Institute for Basic Life Principles, and ATI, Advanced Training Institute, through Bill Gothard, and everything that goes along with that. So both Andrew and I have listened to it or watched it. And Andrew, I am very curious to know, just high level, what are your thoughts? Let's pray.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, what did I? Yeah. So I watched the entire thing in one sitting. I
Yes.
suppose I should also preface this with just huge trigger and content warning. Don't feel like you need to do that.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
as the listener. Seriously, I mean, it's heavy stuff. It really
Yeah.
is.
Mhm.
I was even surprised at how much stuff just felt sort of kind of just even triggering to me. Like, I mean, I was just noticing
Mhm.
stuff that was coming up for me within my own body as I was
Yeah.
listening to just all of this. I think the thing that really struck me is that, we talk about like the IBLP and just the Duggars and just all of, and it's easy to kind of feel like it's, these culty people that are like this fringe of society. They're out there in Arkansas or wherever they were at doing what they're doing. And, but then you start to hear like what the programming actually is, what it actually looks like. And the thing that struck me was, my response, like sitting there was like, well, holy shit, that's what we believed. Growing up, like that's what I was told. And I grew up in Seventh-day Adventism, which is kind of disconnected a little bit from mainline churches and evangelicalism, but at the same time, not that much, like so much of, without getting into specifics, but a lot of just the patriarchal purity culture, just all of the overarching themes that are really present in this documentary. I was just realizing how it's not just restricted to them. That's, you could be saying the same thing about the church I grew up in, because we taught and believed all of those things too.
Yeah. Yeah. There was one of the gals on the documentary. She was one of the sexual assault or victims or sexual misconduct victims. And she talked about how Bill Gothard was kind of viewed as like the Pope and the president and Justin Bieber, like all in one. And I actually resonated when she said that, because like you, I didn't grow up in the IBLP movement. However, I do have a funny story about it, because like it was heavily influential in my life and at my church, even though again, I was at a totally different church than what traditionally we think of, like independent fundamentalist Baptist. I think that's the problem though, because like my friend Tia, who's featured on the story, her story is featured in the documentary most heavily in episode 2, but then she has clips in all of the episodes. Like she grew up Southern Baptist, and it was like baked into that, even though it wasn't overtly taught. And so I feel like the same was very true how I grew up, even though that was not necessarily my upbringing. It was woven into like the umbrella thing. I was like, I don't even know when I learned about that for the first time, but it was young, like very young. And my funny story is that I don't talk a lot about my family and like the specifics of them, because I want to protect their privacy and whatnot. But the night that my parents got engaged to be married, their date. So my dad had this, all planned out, kind of how he's going to propose. He was going to take my mom on this date, and then they were going to go to this place and blah, blah, blah. And the place that they went for their date beforehand was a Bill Gothard rally seminar on like the basic principles for marriage. And, and it wasn't like spur of the moment that my dad proposed, he had it all planned out, but that was like part of their engagement story, was go to the Bill Gothard rally. And then they got engaged afterwards. So I'm like, oh, cool. Yeah. This was really baked in like from the get-go, but it was wild because of exactly what you said. Like, I think I wish they could have pushed that message a little bit harder in this belief. I think that everybody's like, oh, that's very fringe. That's just kind of extreme. It's like, if you have like this tree with these branches of different denominations, this is like at the end of the branch of like the very top, no, it's everywhere, not only in the religion that we grew up in, but then of course, through a lot of what Kristen Kobes-Dumais was saying on the documentary, like this is in our politics, this is in our education, this is in our culture. And it's kind of scary, I guess, just how baked in it is without people even knowing. So we know it's everywhere. It was just kind of crazy to see it all in one spot, kind of this progression, not only with the Duggars, but the like the practices, like how many of them are just so damaging. And yet that was a part of so many people's lives. Was that something you resonated with, or?
I think another thing that historically has kind of made them feel fringe for a lot of folks is like 19 kids. Like, okay, that's like,
God, yeah.
Holy shit, who has 19 kids? But even within this movement, but like for example, just ways that this messaging was also showing up in other areas, just like in Adventism. Like I literally had a Bible teacher at my Adventist Academy draw out that umbrella model. And for those listening who don't know right off what that is, the topmost is God, then it's the husband, then it's the wife, and then it's the children. It's a hierarchy. It's a power structure is literally what it is.
Yeah. Yes.
And so, and then I guess between the husband and between God, I guess you would have leaders like Bill Gothard
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
whoever
Weird
else.
how it always
So,
came back to Bill being
right,
like the top umbrella.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like I literally had that drawn out in Bible class at an Adventist academy. I had no idea
Yeah.
that came from Bill. Like I just thought that's what every Christian
Yeah.
believes. And then also other types of programming that I've heard, like it's
Mhm.
not unique to Bill and all of his stuff over there. And that is
Yeah.
just the idea of well, two things. One, we don't do the whole dating thing. It's courtship for marriage. You do it
Yeah.
young. And one
Yeah.
of I mean, and then once you're married, like you have kids, like procreation is the
Yeah.
purpose of sex and marriage.
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
I've even had different Bible teachers and pastors that I've known within Adventism um, talk about like be very opposed to birth control, things like that.
Yeah.
I will say that is not an official church stance, and even within Adventism, it is kind of some of the more
Yeah.
fringe, outspoken guys that
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
saying this, but nonetheless, it's there.
And I think that, that short clip that they played where they talked about how there was how Michelle had a miscarriage while she was on birth control, which is common. That's like,
Yeah,
but they blame that as like they make that as a sin. Like
right.
I was sinning by being on birth control. And so my
Hmm.
punishment for that sin was that I lost a child or I had a miscarriage. Like that is
Right.
such dangerous, like thinking, believing. And yet that piece, like, even though I agree with you, like my church didn't really overtly say anything about birth control, but like that line of thinking of like the punishment piece, that was absolutely there.
Hmm.
And it's
Yeah,
like it's so devastating because you're already grieving and then you're like, oh, this is God punishing me.
right.
Like pretty messed up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And can we just did you follow the Josh Duggar story like back when it was happening at all?
Um, yeah, actually, I think so.
Okay.
It's been a few years now, but as I was watching the series, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I remember when that happened. Oh yeah, I remember
Yeah.
when that happened. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, can we just talk about how like this whole idea I was, because I feel like there was so much of this that, yeah, it was like out in the public eye and, most people were aware of it and kind of, or watching from afar. And when they brought on that couple that used to be best friends with the parent couple, so Jim, Bob, and Michelle were best friends with this other couple, Jim and Bobby Holt, and Josh Duggar was dating their oldest daughter, during all of this, and
Hmm.
and that with all of the sexual molestation that was happening, like Jim Bob's way of solving that or making it so that Josh wouldn't sin was to try to marry him off to somebody else. And that's where he could redirect his sexual urges. And when they shared that, I mean, I texted my friend Tia, the same one I was talking about earlier, and I was like, oh, this is way worse than we ever knew. Like this was, in terms of like what was happening behind the scenes, everybody knew what was happening, but nobody was actually bringing it forward to the
Hmm.
police, to the people that needed to know so that he could A, get the help that he truly needed, clearly, and then B, so that even more so that the victims would get the help they needed and that there wouldn't be more victims, which now there are. And so I was blown away at that part. I couldn't have even imagined that it was worse than what we already knew.
Right. That is that. I mean, that is a some pretty damning statements that were said,
Yeah,
and
God.
it's like
Yeah.
because yeah, like trying to just marry him off to like kind of
Mhm.
redirect, like you said, but then also it's like, and this maybe wasn't explicitly stated, but also just knowing just how purity culture works within the church. It's also like, and if
Yeah.
these behaviors continue in the context of marriage, at least at that point, you can kind of offload some of the blame onto
Yeah.
the wife. Maybe
Her.
she wasn't being
Yes.
submissive enough, or
Yeah.
whatever,
Available. Yeah.
right, right. And so it's like,
Yeah.
even if it doesn't change the behavior, at least now there's somebody else who can carry the load of that
Yeah.
accountability for what Josh is doing. And it's
It's
like,
so messed
and
up.
that's like the silent part. And yet that's exactly how it
Mhm.
works. We've
It's
seen it.
exactly it. Yeah. Yeah. So, like if we're gonna, have these be prayer requests, I mean, gossip. Uh, yeah, like what were some of your takeaways from it?
I think the biggest takeaway, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but the biggest takeaway is just how widespread this is. It's easy to look
Yeah.
at like, 19 and counting. It's like, oh my gosh, like these folks with 19 kids, or
Hmm.
just the idea of like there's like this cult that is doing whatever it is that it's doing. But my
Hmm.
big takeaway was just this holy shit, like it's not some fringe thing. This is pretty
Yeah.
core to
Yeah.
just about every Christian fundamentalist
Hmm.
denomination that I've ever had known about in the entire
Yeah.
country. I mean, it's very
Yeah.
common. It's very commonplace.
Hmm.
And so with that said, I think that's partly why I think this docu-series can be so triggering to a lot of folks, because it's
Hmm.
not, like I grew up within Adventism. I grew up thinking, when I hear the word cult, I think like Waco, Texas, David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. Like that's a real, like
Yes.
a
Yeah.
compound out in the middle of nowhere that's like getting into it with the ATF, the FBI, or something
Yeah.
like that. Not like everyday homeschool group Christians, which I mean, I was in a Christian homeschool group too, by the way. I was
Yeah.
only homeschooled for 3 years. I'm not as
Yeah.
steeped in it as some folks are, but I do know of that world too.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
it's just so
Yeah.
commonplace. I think that's my takeaway, just how
Yeah.
commonplace this is.
Yeah. Did you use any of like the Bill Gothard? So like his like quote unquote education materials, or did you go through like a different place to get your education?
Um, I actually don't even know. Because
Yeah.
I was
I
young
just
enough,
yeah.
and like so my
Yeah.
mom was
Mhm.
doing like as far as like the educational materials, and then as far as the group that I was a part of, home
Mhm.
now I homeschooled for 3 years, and I was only part of that homeschool group for the last year of
Oh,
that.
gotcha. Yeah.
And a lot of what they were focusing on was more community service, just fun recreational stuff. It wasn't, at least the part that
Sure.
we were involved with. So I
Yeah.
don't know. It wouldn't surprise me, but
Yeah.
I actually don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's kind of like, I think it's two or three really big like homeschool curriculums
Okay.
that are quite popular in the US, and they're all very connected. So we've got like Bill
Okay.
Gothard's, but then we've got like Vision Forum by Doug Phillips. And then there's whatever one the Harrises, Josh Harris and his family, his parents were involved in, which by the way, I don't know if you caught it. The guy they interviewed, Alex Harris, who was
Yep.
talking about the Joshua generation, which is kind of a different program, but similar. That's Josh Harris's brother. um,
Oh, okay. I
which
wondered actually.
yeah,
Yeah,
which
I
I
remember him.
actually thought was really important because they weren't a part of like Bill Gothard's. And I know this only because Alex wrote an article that was posted afterwards. And so they weren't a part of Bill Gothard and IBLP. They were part of something else. But I think you start to see like how everything is so connected in some ways, like it's all very incestuous. So it's
Mhm.
like, okay, we didn't do Bill Gothard stuff, but we had this over here and we were interacting in these ways. And we come together on like these legislative pieces where,
Mhm.
we're trying to push all this legislation through like the Family Research Council and things like that. And so you start to see that it's all the same. It's
Mhm.
just there's kind of little factions that are, kind of running some different groups and things like that, which is again kind of terrifying.
Yeah. Well, and then definitely in the last two episodes of the docuseries, they start talking about this aspect more, but how like so much of like the big picture goal was
Yeah.
to raise up
An
Christian
army.
kids to become
Yeah.
Christian adults who would become Christian
Yeah.
politicians, and to
Yeah.
at all levels of government. But they even did say specifically
Yeah.
Supreme Court justices to overturn
Yes.
things like what we just have seen
Yeah.
happen, like Roe v. Wade, for example, and
Yeah.
things like that. And so it's like, this rise of
Mhm.
Christian nationalism that we're
Yeah.
seeing now, it's like the seeds have been meticulously planted
Yes.
for it over the past 2 to 3 decades.
Yes.
It's not this anomaly that
Yeah.
nobody saw coming. It's kind of like it,
Yeah.
you really do start to see this thread woven throughout,
Yes.
a lot of
I
evangelicalism.
Yeah, I don't know if you are familiar with Brad Onishi's book Preparing for War, but it just dropped in January, and he um really kind of takes this long view perspective where he looks at how did we get to this place politically where we have kind of this marriage of church and state, you know, which we now know is like white Christian nationalism. And he looks at like really the past 40 to 50 years, a little bit before that too. But you're right, like this planting of seeds, like these people that were, you know, seven mountains mandate theology, you know, then here's how we need to get into education and social culture and politics and all these different things. And that is like literally what we're seeing, what Bill Gothard, what this whole documentary was the fruition of all of that. There's this Christian militia, you know, through the alert training. They've got all these other programs that they're just trying to like take over. I mean, like somebody sent me an infograph and with all of the different programs, it's like they've got a cosmetology school. They've got I think it's called like botanical school, basically for like designing flowers and stuff. And it's like they're in every single like area because they're trying to have such a presence there. And it's just, it is, to your point, and maybe even to wrap up, like it isn't fringe. And I wish that they could have pushed that a little bit more. I think, you know, they have limited time, you know, it's four right. episodes. I'm hoping maybe they could do like a season 2, but it is so interconnected and it is so prevalent. Like people who never grew up inside religion, let alone, you know, IVLP or Vision Forum or anything like that, like some of the terminology they use, some of the practices, some of the ways that they believe politically have been so influenced by these people. And it is not fringe. It is very relevant culturally. And I wish they could have gotten into that a little bit more. And I'm just like crossing my fingers, like hoping for a season 2 where they really could explore that, because I think I think people would be shocked to know how not fringe this is.
Yeah. So yeah, it sounds like we've had similar takeaways. It is not fringe, not at all.
No.
You know.
Yeah. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up and say amen?
I don't know. I feel like we covered so much, and I don't want to take us down too many other like any rabbit holes, really. Well, one other thing, I'll try to make this brief and succinct, but it's so relevant, and that is, I'll be honest, I can't remember the name of the sister who was it Jenna? They all start with
Jill.
J's. Jill
Duggar.
Okay, Jill.
Yeah.
Their names all start with J's, and I honestly get them all mixed up. But the one that was most featured on this documentary, and Jill. I just know one of the things that she said or alluded to. This will be a paraphrase, but just when the news broke about Josh, and then just the obligation to protect the family.
Oh my God!
The church, the ministry, and it's just like it's not even about her. I've just seen that a dynamic echoed in so many other areas where there's like abuse that happens or something happens, harm is caused, and this obligation of people who are victims themselves. Yes. Obligation to protect the offender, and like and the idea that you're doing God's will and doing so, and that you're failing. It's like a moral failure if you don't protect them. Like, I mean, she said something to the effect of like the idea of like failing, like they tried and she wasn't able to, and yet here she is literally like a victim of this whole system herself, and yet feeling like she let them down. Yeah. And I think that just hit me pretty powerfully, I think. Yeah. I was, I remember when they did the Megyn Kelly interview, her and the other sister that had been molested. And I remember as a sexual assault victim myself feeling so much rage in what they were saying, but I wasn't rageful towards them. I was rageful towards the system, because I understood so keenly that like the narrative that they had been told and led to believe and then had to tell other people was so victim blaming, so victim shaming, and so like suppressing like what actually happened and the magnitude of what is truly evil, you know, and how he was harming people. And I can leave space to say, like, because of the environment that Josh grew up in, like, we should not be surprised that something like this happened. And yet it still is
absolutely horrifying what he did. And because it continued on, and now we see, you know, I think it was just, you know, last month he was sentenced with what, like 12 and a half, or he's just finished his first year of like 12 and a half years in prison or something like that. And it's like, that never had to happen. And because of this system, it sets people up to groom, to be assaulted, to be very devious in their behaviors in really dangerous and illegal ways. And it's, I could get on a whole soapbox. I won't. I'll save that for another prayer time.
It sounds good.
Yeah. So on a lighter note, I don't know if you caught it in there, and this is maybe kind of end on a high note. Can we just talk about how accurate the woman who was interviewed, her name is Brooke. She described Bill Gothard's look as like the Lego man head. And I cannot get that out of my head anymore. I was like, that is so accurate. You're like the Lego man. So I can see that. Have those moments of levity. Yeah. Well, you know, I feel blessed during this conversation. I'm thankful to be able to share some prayer requests, you know, and we can keep that on our hearts and minds, and you know, maybe like all God's people said, amen. Okay. So we wanted to take a few moments to introduce ourselves, since this is our first episode. We are really committed to making this podcast focus on both professional resources and lived experience. And so in order to do that, we wanted to start it with us to begin with. So we're going to share a little bit about who we are, where we came from, our own process of deconstruction, and then healing from religious trauma. So I get to put Andrew in the hot seat and I'm going to drill him a little bit. Andrew, if you would mind sharing with us just like a little bit about how you grew up and maybe your process of beginning to deconstruct or healing from religious trauma. And then eventually we'll get to where you're at now.
Yeah. So I grew up in Seventh-day Adventism, which anyone who knows anything about that knows, I mean, Adventism is its own beast, pun intended. Very heavy. They're very heavy on the apocalyptic prophetic imagery, like Daniel and Revelation. Gotcha. So anyone who's an Adventist has probably sat through their fair share of Revelation seminars. Yeah. So it's funny. Seventh-day Adventism has a lot in common with evangelicalism, even though I think technically it's not evangelical when you really break down like how churches are described and categorized, but whatever. There's a lot in common, especially with, you know, Christian fundamentalism and the whole apocalyptic fear mongering that we see today. That's kind of a thread that's been a thread in Adventism. It's funny. I always described myself as being a fourth generation Adventist. And if that's a thing in Adventism, like people will describe themselves as what generation of Adventist they are. It's a young denomination. We only came into existence in the 1860s.
Okay. Is that like a badge of honor then to say I'm a fourth generation, or is that?
Well, yeah, especially if it's like third or fourth or beyond. And I'm at least a fourth. There may even be more than that. I don't know. It goes back, as far as I'm aware, to my great grandparents, at least my great grandparents, and maybe even their parents, but anyway. And yes, it is. It's funny, the nuance and the very exclusivist culture that is Adventism. So on the one hand, it's nice when you're in it, when you're a part of it, when that's your community. It's nice because, I mean, I could go anywhere in the world probably and either know people in that area, like know of folks, or we would definitely have mutual friends, connections, pastors or professors, theologians that we knew personally, like had met personally. Very, very tight-knit group in that sense. But that's also the double-edged sword. Leaving is, you don't do it. It's not easy to do. A lot of the folks who leave Adventism don't leave Adventism. They just kind of maybe just sort of drift away, go to a different church, but there's not really like you don't officially loudly leave. You just kind of drift into the back and fade away is kind of how I feel like it's been for a lot of folks. And as a result, there's not a lot of resources and there's not a lot of voices of former Adventists that you will find on social media, for example.
Interesting.
But yeah, I grew up very similar to a pastor's kid. My dad was not technically a pastor, but he did have a degree in theology, and he was a publishing director for a couple of different conferences within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I was born in Maine. We're not from there, though. My dad was the publishing director of the Northern New England Conference, which was headquartered in Portland, Maine. So that's why I was born there. But then, I'm very much from North Carolina. I mean, and then my dad he was publishing director in the Carolina Conference for a few years. And this is like decades ago, but the 90s. And so he traveled around a lot, speaking at various churches. And so in that regard, it was like being a pastor's kid. I went to Adventist academies from kindergarten all the way through high school. So my senior year. It wasn't until after that I actually branched out and went to a local community college. And at the time, it was a huge deal for me. And then I realized, holy shit, public education isn't this horrible, evil thing that I've been told it was. And people quite honestly don't give a damn if I'm a Christian or not. They don't care. And honestly, I was in the Bible Belt. Let's be honest. Even the professors, most of them were Christians anyway. They don't give a shit. I mean, it's, they really don't. And quite honestly, they were a lot nicer and less judgmental than a lot of the Adventists that I had known, about my beliefs, who I was. Like, they were respectful. They didn't care. Like, okay, whatever. Yeah. So, I mean, that's my background. That's where I come from. It has been really nice getting to know more folks in this wider community of like faith deconstruction and just post evangelicalism, all of that. There's a lot of camaraderie there, and I've really appreciated it. And at the same time, it's like, I'm always, though, in the back of my mind, acutely aware of how there's still a very isolating impact of having been a Seventh-day Adventist, because I can count, literally, I'm not exaggerating, I can count on one hand and not more the number of former Adventists that I am connect with on like Instagram right now. And they're great. I love them. They're good friends and we get along. It's awesome. But like, I can only think of maybe 6. Okay. So 5 plus 1, but it's not many. It's not many. That's kind of just the reality of things.
Yeah. I think I only knew one Seventh-day Adventist family growing up. So I guess I technically knew 5 people because they were, all 5 of them. But it's definitely like a niche, almost like a niche of the branch of evangelicalism.
It is.
Or fundamentalism.
And most evangelicals or mainline churches will look at us like, aren't you guys like Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or something? We always get clumped together.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And to be fair, we have common background. Yeah. All of our churches are American-born churches. They came out of the Second Great Awakening. So early, mid 19th century stuff. Yep. Culminated in these different denominations coming about. So I understand why we get clumped together, but it's funny though, because there are a lot of similarities between Mormons and Adventists, even though both sides of that equation get kind of sanctimonious and pissed off by that fact. They don't they don't like being confused with one another, even though it's understandable why they are.
Yes, that makes sense. So what was your process of deconstruction? I'm hearing you say that like earlier, like in your college years, there was definitely some of those moments where you were like, oh, this isn't like what I always taught it was supposed to be. These people don't care, nor do they persecute me, for my beliefs. What was that process for you? Did it start then, or was it at a different time?
Yeah, it was, it's one of those things that in hindsight, even now looking backward, I really can't pinpoint it on one moment of epiphany or anything like that. It's been such a slow process, but part of it was that. Part of it was realizing that this evil monster that is the world, it's not actually the thing that it was made out to be. It's funny. It's been so long since I've read the story, so I still may be totally getting the whole premise of the story wrong, but the individual segment of the story from Don Quixote comes to my mind where he's fighting windmills. He's jousting with a windmill, thinking it's like a giant, and it's like, it's just a fucking windmill, dude. It's nothing. What are you doing? And part of me almost feels like that, having left Adventism, where it's like, there's all of these things that I was taught and conditioned to be afraid of. And like, I'll give you some specifics. Like, Adventism believes that there will be a national Sunday law legislatively passed in the US that'll be like kind of ushering in the end times, where like, in other words, you are legally obligated to observe Sunday as the Lord's day. You then are also penalized. You cannot keep Sabbath, like Saturday, as Sabbath, that, and you'll be imprisoned for doing so if you refuse to honor the law of the land.
Wow.
And that's, that's all related to the mark of the beast and other things. The idea that, at the end of time, it'll be unsafe to still live in the cities. And so there's a lot of emphasis
Mm,
on fleeing the cities, a lot of emphasis on growing your own food, living more
yeah.
rural, sustainable, homestead type lifestyle. And some Adventists take that more seriously than others. I mean,
Sure.
there's plenty that are like, whatever, just live your best life, who cares? But there's plenty that are very paranoid, very preoccupied with end time
Yeah.
events and are preparing accordingly,
Mm,
and
yeah.
just all of that, just like that layer of anxiety, just kind of
Yeah.
always present, never really went away.
Yeah. Do you have any, like, because I agree with you, in terms of like, I don't know that there was just the one moment, right, where it was like, oh,
Right.
here's my light bulb. But as you look back, what do you notice about that journey out? Are there certain things that really stuck out to you that you're like, oh, this was pretty influential in why I left or why I started asking questions?
Yeah. So actually, yeah, there are a couple of things I think that are pretty pivotal. One is from a purely academic standpoint, well, mostly academic.
Mhm.
So my undergrad, before I did my master's in counseling, I got my bachelor's degree in history from a state university. And one of my professors, I think he's actually from Israel himself. He's a Jewish
Mm.
man. And he taught a class called, I think it was just simply Introduction to Islamic Archaeology,
Hmm.
which, if you're not into history or archaeology and don't know anything about Islam, that probably sounds incredibly dry and like would put you to sleep. And yeah, some folks took it as an elective and they dropped it pretty fast. Because yeah, if you're not interested in the topic, it puts you to sleep. I was interested in the topic, but I didn't know that I was. And he just was such a knowledgeable guy and such a kind person. Like he was
Mm.
just, I think he dropped that he was atheist. Not that that really was necessarily pertinent, but as he was discussing Christianity and Islam and Judaism, I mean, he was very tactful with how, nobody was the bad guy or any of that. He was just simply helping us ask good questions and look into the archaeological record and the textual record of, and I think that's really what started really opening up my eyes to just a lot of things and seeing beyond just
Yeah.
Adventism or even just Christianity. And so that was one piece that really got me asking questions, really got me looking at bigger pictures of things. Well, and like for example, like just like the book of Daniel, which to
Mm.
Adventists is very important. Um,
Okay.
but the book of Daniel, like, okay, I think traditionally by Christians, it's thought to have been written in the 6th century BC or something like that, when in reality it was probably
Hmm.
written 300 to 400 years later. Like just little things like
Hmm.
that. Like the evidence does not support that it was written when tradition claims, period.
Hmm.
And things
Hmm.
like that. And so they're like, okay, so that started creating cracks in the foundation of my Adventism. And then
Yeah.
on another much more personal level, it really came down to LGBTQ affirmation or the lack thereof.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as we speak, this is big because
Mm.
the Adventist General Conference President Ted Wilson, literally as we speak, is heading up some, I think it's called the Task Force on Human Sexuality,
Huh.
which is literally just going to be a bunch of bullshit. That's the typical non-affirming stance that Adventism has always had. It's just they're going to
Yeah.
be reiterating that. It comes on the heels of, there was a pastor in, I believe, in one of the European conferences who came out. I think is bi,
Wow.
not I think is bi. I can't remember for sure.
Okay.
But came out to his congregation, and long story short, I mean, it was very much condemned by the powers that
Mm.
be in the church. And
Yeah.
I don't remember if he was technically stripped of his credentials or what exactly, but
Mm.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's like that was the thing. They want to have open conversations about this, and yet if you take a stance that is not or that is affirming, and you are an employee of the church, you will lose your job.
Oh,
So tell
yeah.
me what kind of
Yeah.
an open conversation that's really going to be. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but on the personal level that I talked to, like I had friends like in Adventist Academy that
Yeah.
were queer but could not, or were trans,
Yeah.
or could not be out. It was
Hmm.
not safe to be out at all.
Mm.
You would
Yeah.
probably be expelled if you were out.
Yeah.
Um, and just remembering the harm, just the immense harm that it
Mm.
caused, and then just knowing what I know now as a therapist, like how harmful non-affirming ideologies, whether it's Christianity or just something else, but non-affirming ideologies, how harmful they are
Mhm.
to, LGBTQ folks. And that was, I think, the other big piece. It's like recognizing how immensely harmful these things are. There comes a point where it's like
Yeah.
the question for me no longer was, well, is it biblical? Because it doesn't
Mm.
matter. It's so harmful. Like, I don't care if it is biblical. If okay, let's say that it is biblical to be non-affirming. Okay, fine. Then the Bible itself, I will say, is unethical, and I'm
Mm.
still
Yeah.
going to depart from it. That was basically
Yeah.
my take, and that's kind of what really got me going on that
Yeah.
trajectory.
Yeah. I really resonate with that. I'll share in part of my own story too, but I
Mhm.
think, as a therapist or a therapist in training or wherever you're at, I don't know if this is true for you, but like I remember like coming into contact with humans, like, and humans that were not a part of the church or religion that I was a part of, and being perplexed on some levels because they were so different than what I had been told. Here's what the
Right.
outside world is going to be like. But also then having that real, like, eye-opening experience of like when I have a human sitting across from me who's in tears because of what's happened to them, and they're sharing their experience, say, of being queer and being disconnected or disfellowshipped or de-churched or whatever, like my heart just started to break for that. And when you're sitting in the presence of humans, it's like you have to be willing to like ask the questions and be like, is like, this is a life in front of me. It's one thing to say this thing is a sin, but then to have somebody in front of you who's like dealing with that is
Mhm.
totally different. You can't be unchanged. Like that has to change you. That was so pivotal for me, as especially as it comes to LGBTQ folks. Like I got to that same point where I was like,
Yeah.
I'm looking at this human across from me or in my friendships or whatever, and I can't believe this anymore because I'm watching them hurt. I'm watching them suffer as a result of that teaching.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like you come to a point, and I do remember this. I suppose this is sort of a moment of epiphany or a watershed moment or whatever you want to call it, where I did realize it's like I either need to decide that I don't care if this hurts them, and
Yeah.
and a lot,
Mhm.
like in the interest of biblical integrity or whatever.
Mm,
I either need to decide that it does not matter, or that it
mm,
hurts them because this is right, or it
yeah.
does matter and I need to
Yeah.
change what I believe and how I'm going about this.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, now that I'm where I'm at, looking back on this many years later, I'm grateful that I did chose what I chose, because I'm like, I will now very clearly say I will always err on the side of compassion. And if something's causing
Mm,
harm, I don't care if it
yeah.
comes from the Bible. I
Yeah.
do not
Yeah.
care. I will throw the Bible out before I will throw out a human.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm curious to know for your own self then, like as you were, coming out of religion or your specific denomination and, kind of continuing to walk as it pertains to religious trauma, like what was that for you? Do you have religious trauma? Was that something that you dealt with, adverse religious experiences? What was kind of the impact of all of that on you?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things.
Yeah.
Where to start? Where to start? It's interesting. My story, I don't feel like I have a lot of acute instances of religious trauma
Mm,
in the same sense that some folks do.
yeah.
Another fun fact about Adventists, we don't believe in eternal conscious torment for
Oh,
hell.
interesting.
Yeah. So that doesn't mean that there's not plenty of anxiety to go around. We still manage to make it a very uncomfortable, distressing experience when we talk about the judgment. We will not be outdone when it comes to that. But yeah, no, in fact, I think we're similar to, I think Jehovah's Witnesses are the same. I don't think they
Mm,
believe in a literal eternal conscious torment. But
mhm.
so the way that an Adventist would depict hell is that it's not a location, it's more of a time and event. So it's the earth, the lake of fire. When Christ comes back,
Gotcha.
earth is cleansed by fire. That event in time is hell, but it doesn't persist forever. But at any rate, we still have this judgment, and
Yeah.
that is ongoing in heaven, in the heavenly sanctuary, the most holy place, which is in fact the whole
Mm,
premise of why the Adventist church exists. I won't go down that rabbit trail right now, but like right now as we speak, Adventist
mm,
theology understands that the judgment is literally happening right now and will wrap up, and you won't know when it wraps up, but when it does, then
mm.
that's like the time of trouble, the end times will begin. And so anyway,
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
yeah, a very unique theology, very unique
Mhm.
eschatology that is Adventism. But
Mhm.
yeah, so much anxiety around that, and
Mm.
making and also another thing, like
Yeah.
Adventists do not believe in like once saved always saved, for example. Like you were
Yeah.
very much wanting to always be vigilant to, making sure that
Mhm.
you've confessed your sins, making sure that the Holy Spirit has revealed any secret sins that you may be cherishing and don't even know that you're cherishing.
Mm. Yeah.
Things like that. And so there's those pieces. There's just the isolation piece of leaving Adventism is so very difficult. How do you
Yeah.
do that?
Yes.
And I think the other piece, and this isn't to be fair to Adventism, I don't think this is Adventist specific, but it is very much, I think, just Christian fundamentalism. But that is the way I've seen it really cause harm for me and within my family is more of how it enabled a lot of cycles of abuse within
Mm.
my extended family. And
Yeah.
when I say extended, I mean like the generationally,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
back through the generations. I won't go into all sorts of detail right now, but there's plenty of instances of abuse, like capital A abuse. And it's like, and so much of it
Yeah.
was not directly a result of Adventism, but the Christian fundamentalism piece
Mhm.
of, you know, we forgive, we seek reconciliation,
Yeah.
which usually means enabling things to continue or happen again in the
Mhm.
future, that sort of thing. Like that I will say I've seen that has been an incredibly damaging thing in my family and in
Yeah.
the big
Mm.
picture on a grand scale.
Mm.
So, so like, is that religious trauma? Like, I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of trauma that was
Mhm.
enabled by religious fundamentalism.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. That it's such a journey because I think too, you just like as you come out of these systems, like you're coming out of an entire identity and lifestyle, right? And so it's like everything is impacted. And so, it's like, oh, where do I start? Like, what wasn't impacted,
right.
And yet I think each of us carries with us things that were more or less impacted than what other people have experienced, not in a way of comparison, just in our unique selves. And, so for you, it's like, yeah, extreme anxiety or, this or that. And it really can feel debilitating.
Mm-hmm. The paranoia of end times. I know a lot of
Oh
evangelicals
God.
talk
Yeah.
about that, but Adventists
Mhm.
especially, because remember that Sunday law.
Yes.
We definitely have had this persecution, martyrdom
Mm.
fantasy or whatever, that it would be it wouldn't be non-Christians who hate Christians persecuting us. It would
Right.
be the Sunday keeping Christians, right?
Ah,
It would
yes.
be all of you that
Yeah.
would be chasing us Adventists and Sabbath keepers, into the
Yes.
hills and imprisoning us. And yeah, it's kind of like, are you
Yeah.
prepared to die for your faith? Are you prepared to,
Hmm.
die for Jesus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely being a martyr for sure. Yeah. Oh gosh, that like brings up so much for me too. So,
Mhm.
so where would you say you're at now? Do you ascribe to a different religion or faith background, spirituality practice? Do you have a new label? What are you?
Well,
Right?
I always frustrate people who ask me that, because I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't have a label, but I know what they
Yeah.
mean when they ask. So I try to just be nice and entertain it. Like, I'm a
Yeah.
humanist, I suppose. That's the
Mhm.
closest thing. And what I mean by that, like, I wouldn't even firmly say, oh, I'm a secular humanist, i.e., like an atheist. Like, I wouldn't even say that. I mean, I
Mhm.
guess I'd be closer to like an agnostic atheist in that sense. But
Yeah.
I say humanist because my thing is, I don't know whether God, as I was taught of God, that
Mhm.
construct, whether that entity exists. I don't know if any other entity exists.
Mhm.
I've not personally seen any empirical evidence to say it does,
Yeah.
but I also recognize that doesn't mean that it doesn't. But
Yeah. Yeah.
again, I'll like when I said that I would err on the side of humanity, on human suffering.
Mhm.
It's the same thing with my humanism, is that I don't really know whether God does or does not exist. I'm not going to make my whole identity
Yeah.
around the hypothesis as to whether or not divinity does exist. I don't give a fuck. But humanity and
Yeah.
its suffering does exist, and so I'm going to orient myself
Mhm.
around humanity. Hence, humanism.
Yeah.
There you go. The rest of it is
Yeah.
kind of like, I'm not saying there's not an answer out there. It's just, I don't know it. I don't know that we
Yeah.
can know it. It's inconsequential. And
Yeah.
I see a lot of folks wasting a lot of bandwidth and a lot of energy arguing questions that kind of are irrelevant when they could be doing something to alleviate the suffering that is literally at their feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah.
kind of my reasoning
Hmm.
for that.
I really love that. Yeah. Is your hope like that you're trying to find a new spiritual path, or is it just kind of like, I'm going to be present and whatever comes my way, I just kind of deal with it essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm unspiritual, but certainly not in any real traditional sense, I guess.
Yeah.
Kind of just, being present with and just appreciating the universe, the natural world as it. I mean, I'm reading a book on that on trees, a natural history of North American trees, as I mentioned earlier. So that says a little bit. Like, it's like, and I don't. This sounds so fatalist, but like, we're not saying this, but like I say this hopefully, like we're not getting out of this world alive, but I don't mean that in like a scary way. Like, we are literally made up of the same substance that the universe around us is made up of. I don't know what consciousness looks like after I'm gone from this world, but maybe there's still something, and it's just something I'm not aware of now because I'm not in a place where I can know about it, because I'm not there yet. So I don't know. It really is that whole idea of being open, holding with lightness, being curious.
I love that
about the universe. Like, I really truthfully am it to a place where that's kind of what I feel towards most things. It's not to say that the stress just doesn't exist, because that would be a lie, but I'm really able to just kind of roll with it in a lot different of a way than I was even 5 years ago, but certainly different than what I was at 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah. It just sounds really like open and free, just like, not having to have just this like very rigid path that you're on there. It sounds like there's so much room for humanity. I mean, truly, not to be like redundant on what you're saying, but that's just what is the priority now. That's awesome. Well, anything else that you feel like sharing about yourself?
I'm sure more things will come out. I don't know. I feel like I've talked about myself enough. Making me feel self-conscious now.
Well, I've taken down many unspoken prayer requests that I'll be holding close to my heart, and we'll be offering them up later on.
I appreciate. I'll say that I appreciate that, which is what I say to folks who say, "I'll pray for you." Used to piss me off, and now I'm like, "Okay, you do that. Thanks."
Thank you. Sure.
Thanks.
Yes.
It's easier just to smile and nod and go about my day. But
yeah, absolutely. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I'm curious about your background and
where I come from.
Yeah,
I think there's definitely overlaps in our story for sure. Of course, we grew up in different denominations. I was mostly was a part of the Evangelical Free Church, which is used to be what's called the Dutch Reformed Church. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a clue into our Stoicism and background, where we came from, right? So when people are like, well, what is that kind of a church? I usually like to say it is like the theology, kind of like the hellfire brimstone of Southern Baptist, mixed with like the rigidity of Church of Christ, mixed with the stoicism of Lutheranism. And that's, then we wrap that all up in like Reformed theology or Calvinism. So it's just a real dumpster fire of awfulness.
Honestly, I think that minus the Calvinism and minus the Sunday keeping, you guys sound similar to Adventists.
Yeah, well, and honestly,
I think they would get along.
Yeah, I mean, truly, when I said earlier, I said I only knew 5 Adventists. It was this family. I knew them because they came to our church. They were like relatives of another church member or whatever, and they came to our church and eventually, like, quote unquote, converted into like our church. But there really wasn't that much difference. I remember, talking, and there's a couple things that they changed, of course, going to church on Sundays, on Saturdays, and I think because you guys do Saturday church, is that right?
Right.
Yeah. And so, there were some differences there, but generally, like theologically speaking, there was a lot of overlap and similarity. So, so that's like the brand that I grew up in and was in that church for almost 30 years. I was in a ministry family as well. My dad was a director at a fundamentalist Christian camp, and we actually lived there on the campgrounds. We had a house, didn't have to we weren't in tents or anything like that.
No, I know we have one too. So
yeah.
I already know. I'm already envisioning a big church camp with like actual permanent buildings and all the things. Yeah.
Yep. So that's where we grew up. And on the one hand, like I can look back now, especially as an adult, and be like, wow, what an incredible like experience. You know, not every kid gets to grow up with a lake or a ropes course or a horse corral right across the street. And so I now am like very grateful for that. And I think at the time I took it for granted, like, oh, I've got a lake just, you know, down the street a little bit. And now I would love to live on a lake. Like that would be amazing. But yeah, that's probably been like the last piece that I've kind of unpacked in terms of like the impact of living in a space like that. Because there were some pros, of course, but then we're also talking about things like isolation. You're obviously like in this bubble 100% of the time, especially on the weekends and during the summers when there's people there. There's very strict, you know, codes of dress and how you can speak and how relationships are supposed to be and all of these things. And, you know, the nice part of it is that was pretty congruent with what the church was preaching as well. So it wasn't like I was having to applied one set of rules here and then another here. It was very fluid in that way, but of course, very restrictive. Because I grew up in the North, education wise, I grew up in a state that really prioritized education. I say that to contrast where I'm at in the South, where there's a very low priority on education. And so, my mother is an educator by trade. I mean, she's a licensed teacher, a credentialed teacher. And so that was always very important that were educated, which I'm extremely grateful for. So I did go to public school, but there was a period of time, I think like in my middle school years, where I was begging my parents to be homeschooled because I was so terrified of being pulled down and tempted, you know, by all of my peers around me, that I would be sinning and I would be making ungodly decisions. And I just thought that the better option would be to be removed from that, to be homeschooled and to not have to be tempted by all this peer pressure. I was so scared. And my parents ultimately made the decision that no, that was not going to be a good path for me. And I am glad that that's the decision that they made. But I do think that speaks to like how deeply those messages were already living inside my body, like the extreme fear and anxiety that I experienced as my baseline normal on a daily basis. I was very anxious. So I am grateful that I went to like public school, but I also know that the result of that was that I definitely had undiagnosed anxiety and eventually depression as well. But I remember whenever I graduated from high school, this is when purity culture was really just coming onto the scene. And so like Josh Harris's book had just come out. And of course we didn't call it purity culture back then because we didn't have that language. But I was very aware of like what my role was supposed to be as a woman, like what my path was going to be set out for me. And so I was very smart. I was like, I had a lot of kind of academic, athletic, musical credentials that allowed me to get scholarships to a myriad of different colleges. But I was not allowed to go to any of them for a variety of reasons. One of which is going, if you're just going to be a wife and a mom, like, why do you need to have student debt? Why would you need to go get a degree? Like, you're going to be stay-at-home mom anyways. And so I was logical enough at the time to be like, okay, I guess I'll just go to the community college because that'll like help me pass the time until I get a husband, essentially. But I remember walking out of my high school graduation and feeling this weight descend on me, going, oh my gosh, every choice that I make from this point forward has eternal consequence. And on a general level, that's true, because when you turn 18, when you're an adult, you have to face adult consequences. But there was this bigger, like eternal thing of like, if I wear the wrong shirt and my future husband sees me and he doesn't like it, and decides that's not a godly shirt to wear, and he turns around and goes and finds somebody else, the rest of my life is done because that one person who was supposed to be my future husband is now no longer interested in me. And that was terrifying for me. Like, talk about like religious scrupulosity and anxiety. Like, even thinking back to like how I had to function in that is like, like it makes me want to like shake it out, because it was just so like prevalent, right? You know, finding God's will literally was like finding a needle in a haystack, and the haystack just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger as each day went by. And so I remember that to be a very distressing time. And as a result, things like purity culture are coming into my life in a more kind of like, that's when like all the books were coming out and they offered these like beautiful solutions, right? You do these things and then God rewards you with these other things. And so in a weird way, purity culture really provided at least the illusion of stability for me. Whereas like, okay, I can do this. I hate all these rules, but I'm going to follow them because then I'm going to get this and my life is going to look like this and that's going to be better. And the only problem with that is that I was following the rules and the things didn't happen. So I was doing all the modesty stuff and making all the rules and all these things and no husband came. And so I eventually accepted a position working at the church that I was at, or that I had grown up at. And initially started in like a ministry assistant role and worked my way up to technically a director position, but I was a woman, so I couldn't be called a director. So I was a coordinator, but I was doing all the director work, though not being paid for it. And really experiencing a lot of spiritual abuse. Of course, I also did not have words for that at the time. I was connected enough to my body to know something's not right here. But I also was wise enough at the time to know if I follow that through, I will lose everything. And I don't think I can right now. I don't think I have it in me to see this for what it is and then leave, because I would have no friends, maybe no family, no place to live, no place to get a paycheck to eat, to, whatever. So I kind of just had to stuff all of that down. But eventually the spiritual abuse really got so bad that I ended up quitting. But then, of course, tried to get back in because I was so scared. I didn't want the devil to get me. You're always told, like, if you leave the fold, the devil will get you. Like all these bad things will happen. And that's God's way of punishing you and trying to get you back into the good graces of the people at the church and things like that. And so I really felt like I couldn't do anything other than try to go through this like process of like succumbing to whatever they wanted from me, so if they needed more time or energy or resources from me, I had to give that because that was providing a sense of security. However, as that was happening, because I had quit my job at the church, I also had started working at a community college, and it was the first non-religious workplace that I was a part of, because I had worked at like Christian bookstores and the camp and like all these things. And it was this really weird contrast where like you were saying, people didn't care. They didn't care if I believed this or that. They didn't judge me if I made a mistake. People weren't ready to hold me accountable for things. It was very weird. There was like excitement about the skills and abilities that I had, and they were looking for paths for me to kind of climb the corporate ladder. And that was just never a part of my experience. And I really did not like the job, but I liked that it gave me a new perspective. And it's ultimately what prompted me to go back to school for my master's degree. And that's then kind of what opened the door in my eyes to like, hey, what I've been taught, I don't think is right. And so I would say like, that's kind of where I started deconstructing, actually, was like, probably, God, I don't know, like 17 years ago, whenever I started grad school, similar to you, where it's like, there's these real people in front of me, and I don't think that what I've been taught, like they don't fit in this box of what I've been taught. And I think I'm going to choose the person over the teaching. And so that was really, really important. Like in my process, I know I'm kind of jumping ahead, but like, as far as like how I grew up and where I started, like kind of moving out, it was people. But I should add one other thing in there too. Whenever I moved to Nashville, so I'm skipping ahead a bunch of years. I moved to Nashville about 13 years ago. I started attending a quote unquote progressive Southern Baptist church, which I don't even know if that actually exists. But the one thing that they did allow for was questions, like for people to ask questions, and their faith was not immediately doubted. And that was such a good stepping stone for me, because previously I had questions about things. And of course, that's when you were told, oh, you're doubting your salvation. This isn't okay, and so to have this space where I could ask questions and and do that without having to worry if my salvation was being called into question was a really, really nice stepping stone. It was what I needed. And I had some other things happening during that time that allowed me to continue to lean into that and to see, I don't know if God exists. I don't know where God is, but I don't think it's this version that I've been taught for, almost 30 years at this point. So that's, a little bit about how I grew up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, thank you for sharing all of that. And yeah, so it's interesting. We both have backgrounds where parents were leaders in the church, but not technically pastors.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. My dad was, I don't know how, I know different churches have or denominations have different kind of leadership hierarchies and positions, deacons, elders, like those sorts of things. So my dad definitely had roles in the church like that, where he would, be a deacon or an elder or like some interim leadership roles, but primarily he was the director of the camp. And then worked with the youth group.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. What I'm curious, what prompted you to, so I know about the going back to school, but at what point did you decide you did want to do therapy, that whole realm?
Probably when I was in fifth grade.
Oh wow. Okay.
So I've kind of always had this nature of really loving people's stories and being genuinely interested and having some amount of insight. And I remember my friends, even back in middle school, they're like, someday we're going to be paying you to listen to us, which I always thought was really funny. And I kind of dismissed it at the time, of course, especially in the thick of all of fundamentalism. That didn't really seem like an attainable goal for me. How would I become a therapist and also be a mom, right? Because I'm gonna have 13 kids. So
right.
Right. And so it was this natural thing. It was just something I was always drawn to. And of course, it shifted over many years, how I thought of therapy, what I thought therapy was, as a middle schooler versus what I know it is now. It's not giving people advice and telling them what to do, but always that interaction with others, the compassionate witness piece was always something that has been a part of who I am. And so I should say my undergraduate degree is in Christian ministry and Bible. And I logically put together, that's not going to get me anywhere. So I've gone as far as I can go as a woman with a degree like this. If I want to have a career where I don't have to be tied to this specific community, I have to do something different. And so that's where therapy or going back to school to be a therapist came into play, because I was this would allow me, deep in my soul, I knew I cannot stay here, but I also knew I couldn't go anywhere else. And so once the idea of going back to school and becoming a therapist was kind of on the table, it was oh, if I do this, I can move, I can make a new life for myself. I can, do whatever I want, essentially. So it became very appealing and kind of a natural just outflow of who I was.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah. And now you've done that,
I have. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's exactly what I want it to be. I've been doing this for almost 15 years and I love it.
It's interesting. I actually didn't even mention how I went into therapy. I won't totally take us down that whole backstory, but I had applied to seminary and the financing was taking a bit. I just wasn't sure, it was a lot of money. And so finally I was like, you know what, I'm just going to, in the meantime, work on a master's degree here at home.
Yes.
And clinical mental health counseling is what I chose. Cause I'm I want to help people. I want to engage with people. That was the common denominator. Even when I was still wanting to stay in the church, thought I was still going to be in the church. That was still the common denominator. I wanted to help people.
Yes.
And the rest is history.
Yeah. There we go.
I did not go to seminary. Spoiler alert for those who don't know, I did not end up going.
Yes, I get that. Yeah. I love that. It is always interesting to know how people get into this field for sure, because it usually is exactly what we're talking about. We love people
Yeah.
and we want to be able to provide a source of support, compassionate witness, something.
Mhm.
It's just that our motivations have changed a little. Like
Right.
why we want to do that has now changed, which I'm okay with.
Yeah. I think both why we want to do it, but also just how we understand to best do it, you know?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Like I've often described how like my value of wanting to help folks actually has never changed, but how I know to
Mhm.
best do that has changed. Because when I was a little kid,
Yeah.
growing up, when I grew up, Top Gun was a big movie. I wanted to be an Air Force fighter pilot. And of course, I was, a little kid growing up watching the Army commercials, drinking the Kool-Aid of, oh, yeah, like I'll join the US Armed Forces and that's going to do the most good in the world. And then, I realized that's bullshit as I grew up. And no, I'm not going to do that. Okay. And then I wanted to be a police officer. Same reasons. I like, okay, never mind. Then I wanted
Yeah.
to be a pastor. And then again, realized, no, there's issues there too. And most recently, therapist, coach,
Yes.
whatever, something in that
Yeah.
line, that capacity.
Yeah.
So here I am. The
Yeah.
value never changed, but how
Yes.
I
The
understood to
way.
live it out
Yeah.
has definitely changed
Yeah.
and evolved.
Oh, that's really cool. I love that.
So yeah, I could have
So,
in another life I could have been a fighter pilot, I guess. I don't know. And then we wouldn't be here having this
I
podcast
know
conversation because I'd,
exactly.
you know, be out flying F-18s or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you chose this path. This is good. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
So I'm curious, what is your experience with religious trauma and healing and just unpacking all of that?
Oh, I love that you used unpacking. How very pastoral of you. I think, that I resonated with what you were talking about. Kind of like that, where do I begin? Right. I think
Right.
when we talk about like, this is a system that we've been in our whole entire lives, there's not an area of our life that remains unimpacted. I don't even know if that's a word, but everything's impacted. But I think for me, especially, when I look at some of the things that have taken the most amount of time and energy and effort, like areas around purity culture. I'm also somebody who is like, I identify as like a victim of or survivor of sexualized violence. And when I look at like my process of healing from that, compared to like purity culture has always been much deeper, much more difficult, much harder to resolve, because of the pervasive nature of all of those messages living inside me. There, like you said, there wasn't one thing that happened that we can point back to and be like, oh, that's when purity culture harmed me. It was this like overwhelming, pervasive, inescapable messaging and way of
Mhm.
living life. And so I think that that's probably been what has popped up the most. And I think, purity culture, a lot of people are like, oh, that's just like, don't have sex till you get married. And that's a teeny tiny sliver of it. But there's so many other things about our identities,
Yeah.
shame, anxiety, hypervigilance, that all is wrapped up into all of this. And so when I say like, that's probably been some of the hardest stuff to really resolve and heal from, I'm not just talking like sex before marriage. I'm talking about all of that, the way that it lives inside you and shapes your view of yourself and the world. And so untangling that and resolving that has definitely been, it's taken a long time. And I'm certainly not saying there's nothing left to resolve anymore. I'm sure there's always going to be things, but I would say that's where I've had to spend a lot of my time and energy, in terms of my own healing.
Mhm.
And then even just, I notice stuff all the time where I'm like, oh, I don't do this thing anymore, or I do this thing instead, just like little things that are like residual leftovers from religion. Like, I know we'll talk about like, what are you, where are you at? And it's like,
Mhm.
I shy away from labels, right? Because the label presupposes all these other things about me. And that feels really, really scary because I spent about 30 years like that. And so
Right.
even those things, I think like noticing like my daily ways of thinking and moving throughout this world, I think are really reflective of some of my earlier experiences and or the work that I've done. And so I'm a person who believes that healing is a lifelong process. There's not like a period at the end of the sentence of like, there, I'm done, I'm healed, this will never impact me again. But I'm somebody who believes like this is this is an ongoing process, but all of the small moments count. And
Mhm.
so every time that I'm able to like recognize, oh, I'm activated, or this trigger happened, or I'm responding or thinking in a very fundamentalist way, like, and I can pull myself out of those and cope in different ways. Like I call those moments of healing. And so I would say my
Mhm.
healing is very much a daily process. It's a moment by moment. It's not usually big cathartic moments. It's usually just like little tiny moments of every day where I'm like, oh, I'm doing that thing differently, or that didn't impact me the way that it did yesterday, which I'm happy about, right? Because so much of
Yeah.
religious trauma is very complex. It's not just one experience, of the pastor abused me or this or that thing happened. It's this over time thing of like, this was my entire identity and how I lived. And so to step outside of that and continue making steps towards who I want to be, what my life actually is, I don't know, it feels freeing.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. It's so interesting, talking about just purity culture and just everything that entails. And
Mhm.
one thing I was just thinking, and I know we'll get more into this as we talk more about religious trauma and just how trauma works, but one
Yeah.
thing it just came to my mind is it's like if you're like healing from having been struck by a car, like a
Mhm.
literal physical injury. Okay, that's one thing. Everyone's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened. Like, we're going to do what you got to do to get better and so forth. It's a very, very different ball game. If not only are you healing from that, but you're also now being told, and the reason you were hit by a car is something
Yeah.
that is inherently flawed and fucked up within yourself.
With you.
And
Yes.
furthermore, maybe you even deserve to be hit by it. What were you doing? Even though
Yes.
you were following the rules, you were on the sidewalk, you were obeying traffic signals, you were all of it. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that is some of what really happens with purity culture and a lot of stuff
Yeah.
within fundamentalism. It's like you are inherently at fault for all the things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. I can really see that in my own life for sure. Hmm.
Yeah. So I know you don't like labels. I don't either, as a you know, but
Yeah.
hey, but you would tell me a little bit about where are you now? Like how would you describe
Yeah.
that journey?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm similar to you where it's like when people ask me that, I'm like, I know what you're asking, but like, do I have to put a label, right? So I tend to go with like the most general one I can, which is more like agnostic.
Mhm.
Similar to you where it's like, I don't know. At all. Like I don't know what is the afterlife. I don't know if there's a God, if there's not a God. I don't know any of these things. Like there's not really a way I can know. And I'm okay with that, actually. I think one of the things within fundamentalism is there's this like need for certainty. Here is what is true and here is what is not true.
Mhm.
And that does speak to the human nervous system in terms of like providing a sense of stability and security. But in so many cases, it's just an illusion because it's not really accurate. And it creates even more fundamentalism. So to live in that space of gray where there's doubt and uncertainty is not always pleasant feeling.
Mhm.
And yet there is so much color and life there. Like I love now to like hold to everything loosely and not be defined by things because it means I always have the opportunity to be wrong and to grow from it. And to me that is really cool. I love that. And to subscribe to something and say I am this feels like it puts me back in this box that then it's hard to get out of. I can't stretch my arms. I spent 30 plus years not being able to do that. I don't want to put myself back into a box. So if somebody needs to know what are you so that they can like categorize me, I tend to say something more general. I love what you said about like humanism or agnosticism, because I'm like, that's going to be the most general I can go because I'm me. That's what I am, and who I am today is probably going to be pretty much the same tomorrow, but also could be really different. And I want permission to be that. I want permission to never have to stay stagnant and to always keep growing and learning. And that was really actually how I started my deconstruction process in regard to like the fear piece of like, oh, can I ask these questions or whatever? I had this idea of like, all right, if God is sovereign, like I've been taught, then there's nothing I can do, nothing I can ask, nowhere I can go where God's like, well, shit, I didn't see that one coming. And so I just like gave myself permission to like ask questions and ask questions and ask questions until all of a sudden I didn't need like that version of God anymore. I'd grown out of that. And that kind of is how I like to live the rest of my life. Like I'm going to just be open and I'm going to trust that, like I just need to keep taking one step forward. I don't need to have all the answers. I can be present. I can be compassionate. I can live by my values, and I can change those too if I need to. And if that leads me back into religion one day, even though that's really hard for me to fathom at this moment, then so be it. And if it doesn't, that is fine too. So I'm labelless.
I like what you mentioned, the opportunity to be wrong, because I mean, the way I think both of us grew up and were raised, like that's not an opportunity. That's a threat. That's a danger. That's something you avoid. Like you don't sit with the possibility that you could be wrong. There are certain answers and we need to find them, and we need to pray about that. And we need to strive with the Holy Spirit and through studying. All the things, so I just like that reframe. It's
kind of fun. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, this is good. I'm sure our stories will continue to come out over the course of all of our podcast episodes, but I think it's good that people get a good flavor for like who we are, because, this is like intense stuff that we're talking about, and we've got stuff to share. We've gone through it too. We've gone through it too.
Yeah, for sure.
So this episode, we are going to be talking about what religious trauma is. One of the things we want to do with our podcast is have what we're calling touchstone topics. And these are topics that we're going to revisit on a regular basis every year, probably a couple times a year, just to kind of lay the foundation for what religious trauma is and how it impacts us. So our touchstone topics that we'll be covering today and over the next several episodes are: what is religious trauma? Talking about religious trauma in the nervous system, deconstruction versus deconversion versus dechurched. We're also going to be talking about spiritual abuse and adverse religious experiences, and the difference between therapy, coaching, and psychiatry. Like I said, these are going to be episodes that we'll revisit a couple times a year just to create that foundation so that everybody's kind of on the same page and has resources to go back to. But today we are going to start with one of the questions that I get asked the most. I'm sure, Andrew, you do too. And it is, what is religious trauma? And so I'm going to put you on the hot seat, Andrew. What's religious trauma?
Oh, you beat me to it. I was going to ask you. In 10 words or less, what is religious trauma, Laura?
I got an answer. I want to see what yours is.
In 10 words or less? Okay.
I do.
Well, my thing, I mean, religious trauma is trauma. And so I don't think I can define religious trauma without defining trauma. 100%. And that's usually the route I go, because it's really not so much about what happened to you, but your body's physiological response to that. And so physiologically, I don't think it's different than any other kind of trauma. It's just that it's one that's less talked about. I think it's becoming more talked about, but hasn't been as much talked about. To try to succinctly define trauma, let me back to the original question. I think it's just any time that your body is physiologically distressed and it's too much, too fast. It's that overwhelm that shows up. I mean, that can look different in so many ways. We can get into the nuance of all of that, but succinctly, that's what it is. And religious trauma, of course, can come from a number of things. I mean, it could be, for example, fear of hell can elicit that kind of thing. End times anxiety can elicit those types of responses. Just the power dynamics that folks experience in church with like spiritual abuse, or like specifically from a leader in the church, that can come back to that. Can still be religious trauma. So I mean, I could speak endlessly on this topic, but I'm curious. I want to hear you. I think you probably have an even more succinct definition than I do. So,
I mean, my under 10 words one was religious trauma is trauma. Like that's literally like the most succinct definition. So you took it from me, but that's okay. No, I think you're absolutely right, because when we talk about religious trauma, we have to start at trauma. What is trauma? And so I describe it very similarly to you. Trauma is not the thing that happens to us, but the way that our nervous system or our body responds to the thing that happens to us. which I think means that trauma is very subjective. So what is traumatic for you may or may not be for me, and vice versa. It is embodied. It lives in our body. It's not just in our mind. We don't think it away. And yeah, it can absolutely be a result of religion. And I think for me, what I'm coming to kind of, or how I describe it more and more, is I'll actually say that the word religion or religious in religious trauma is really an adjective that helps us better understand the context where the trauma came from. So when we think about things like trauma from war or developmental trauma, trauma from sexualized violence, those aren't different kinds of trauma, like in terms of how it lives in our bodies, but it does help us understand where the trauma originated from, maybe some different things that we might need to work on. I often say, like somebody who has religious trauma is probably not going to be triggered by, say, car backfire, whereas somebody who experienced trauma from war may be triggered by car backfire, but would not be triggered by walking through Hobby Lobby and hearing a hymn being sung, right? And so that term religious just kind of better helps us understand the context and gives us some clues into where we might need to do some extra work, like in our recovery process that is more unique to the religion. But in terms of how we resolve the trauma, like how trauma lives in our body, I think that's the same, regardless of where the trauma is stemming from: religion, childhood, war, natural disaster. We're talking about the same thing. So I very much agree with that definition. And I think we don't, to your point too, like we don't like clinically have a super duper succinct, definition. If you were to say, what is trauma? Like there's a million different definitions, but I tend to be similar to you. It's when anything that's too much, too fast, too soon, like overwhelms our ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. And that can live in our body like trauma or result in things like PTSD or CPTSD. I think that's how I mostly define religious trauma. And I know we both kind of skirted around like the word nervous system or physiology. We'll talk about that in another episode. I think that's really important. That's a very important part in understanding trauma and religious trauma. But I think to say religious trauma is trauma actually then opens us up to a lot of different resources and interventions and therapeutic modalities and healing modalities, because there are some really great ones that have great research around them. And even though they're not specific to religion, they are general to trauma, which means we can take them, they can work.
Right. Yeah. No, I do think that's really important. And I was going to say the same thing. Like, I think nervous system knowledge helps. And we're going to talk more about that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
In like future episodes, but for right now, I think it's so important just to validate religious trauma as trauma, because I've had folks ask me specifically. I've even had a journalist ask me like, okay, so religious trauma specifically, how does one heal from that? I'm like, the same way you would trauma. Yeah,
I feel like sometimes I get out of like a soapbox. There's different people that try to put like different labels. They're like, oh, it's religious trauma, this or whatever, and it's like, no, we don't. I know we're going to talk about like diagnosing in the DSM, but like I know there's people that are like, we want to get something like religious trauma or religious trauma syndrome in the DSM. And I'm like, please don't, like, because then that means we have to do all this new research in order for it to be this like legitimate diagnosis, when in reality, let's focus on trauma. Let's get trauma in the DSM or in our diagnostic manuals and do it well. And then we can use all of that, like in working with religious trauma. But I think we're starting to turn a corner clinically where people are starting to realize exactly what you're saying. Religious trauma is trauma. And so we have access to a lot of resources the same way you would heal any other trauma.
Right. Absolutely. And, and now we've kind of skirted on this one too, like when it comes to definitions of trauma, according to, say, the DSM, which those who aren't clinicians, that is like the gold standard of diagnostics in the United States. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. Is that what the whole thing?
Yeah.
And truthfully, its definition of trauma is pretty restrictive.
Very much so.
In fact, even complex trauma isn't explicitly recognized in the DSM.
And I think it's worth noting too, that actually, so when we look at in the DSM for trauma, we are looking primarily at PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
which have some very specific criteria that you would meet. And that criteria, like of PTSD, or the diagnosis of and the criteria of PTSD, was only introduced like 40 years ago, which is not that long. So there was a long time where people are dealing with trauma and it really wasn't even acknowledged in our DSM, in our diagnosing manuals. It wasn't until I think it was 1980 that it was added in. And even then, it was very restrictive. It was really limited to things like natural disaster, war, kidnapping, things like that, and sexualized violence, which of course all can result in trauma. But it was very limited in saying like, these are just like kind of this little group of things that would result in PTSD. And obviously we know that is not true. And research went far beyond that point. The problem is the DSM didn't. They are still like feet in the, what is it, like digging their heels in going, no, like we're not going to expand the definition of trauma. We're not going to include complex trauma, even though there is so much research around it. It's a political thing. It's an insurance and political thing as to why it's not in the DSM. That's a whole soapbox I could get on, but I won't do it here.
It is. Well, I'll do it a little bit for you. I literally had a psychiatrist tell me, he's like, well, if we were to put in complex trauma into the DSM the way that some of y'all are proposing, everybody would have it.
Yes.
Which is a bit of a damning cell phone statement more than that, that wasn't the flex he thought it was.
Yeah. Yes. And what they're also not saying is they would have to go back and revisit every single piece of research that allowed for the diagnoses to be in there, other diagnoses to be in there in the first place. Because if we're looking at it through a trauma-informed lens, then we go, hey, this childhood thing or this depression or this anxiety is not just this isolated thing in a vacuum that this happened. There's all these other things that were precursors for it that led to this diagnosis, which insurance companies and, different political organizations do not want to have to deal with.
Right.
Yeah. There's our soapbox for the day.
So I was going to say, I could even go on the whole soapbox of like healthcare being a for-profit industry, but I'll just leave that there. But speaking of things not being in a vacuum, I think that's actually a good metaphor. Even just recognizing the big picture evolution of our understanding of trauma, because you go about 100 years ago and you had soldiers coming back from World War I and they called it shell shocked at the time.
Shell shock. Mm-hmm.
And, as the progression goes, like, it's like, okay, initially this condition, well, this is unique to soldiers, men who were fighting, who literally saw death, were threatened with death. Doesn't exist with civilians. And then we find actually it does. Okay. Civilians can have it too. But it's still only things that were overtly physically threatening. Now we're realizing, actually you can have these symptoms even if you maybe didn't directly experience violence or a threat of serious physical injury. And now I think with religious trauma, we're also to a place where it's like, and also psychological, theological, spiritual frameworks and ideologies actually can exhibit the same things. And I think we're just at that cusp where it's like, we're starting to realize this is real. Like, because I see what shows up in the folks I work with, my clients, like, and you can't tell me that's not trauma. They can tell you it's trauma. They know what it is. And I think, but the powers that be and just different political bodies and, the industry as it is, I mean, it's just, I think we're in that growth period where it's like, we're expanding and there's pieces that are trying to pull it back to what they're comfortable with and what they're familiar with.
Yeah. And maybe this is an unpopular opinion. I do like having different criteria and, whatnot. When I work with clients, I always say I'm not the expert of somebody's life or their lived experience. I'm the expert of like the process, like a structure that I'm creating, or I might know a few more things because of my education and training and things like that, but certainly not the expert of somebody's life. And so I think there is validity in being able to say, like, here's markers, here's things that we can look for, here's what's going to show up. And that it's probably more prevalent than we've given it credit for. But I think it is so helpful to have those parameters to say, you might have trauma, you might not have trauma, right? Like, and it's not a comparison game of like, who has it worse or anything. It's simply giving us language to be able to categorize or organize our experience. Because when we do that, we can really seek the help that we need. I know this sounds really kind of funny, but like, when I received a diagnosis of complex PTSD, it was the biggest relief to me ever. Some people feel really like that's the worst thing ever, right? For me, I was like, oh, this is all helping me to categorize my experience. It removed so much shame almost instantly. Like I wasn't just some fuck up. There was a reason these things were happening, but then it also gave me a direction that I could go so that I knew like, oh, I need to do this or make accommodations for myself here, seek this support and those sorts of things. So I think there's something really important about being able to have that language so that you can know what it is that's happening. But I think we have to look for it outside of a place like the DSM or, some of these more official, documents, like with insurance companies and things like that, because it's very restrictive. And it's usually ends up not being that helpful. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Judith Herman, kind of her like seminal textbook is called Trauma and Recovery. And she's really the one, everybody talks about Bessel van der Kolk, the Body Keeps the Score, great book. He's done excellent work, of course, but Judith Herman is really the one who put complex trauma on the map, quote unquote, where she was the one who started to realize, hey, civilians can have this even if they haven't been through these war experiences. And she did start to notice all these dynamics of what she then termed as complex trauma, or what we also would call CPTSD. Mm-hmm. And she said, these are situations that are like inescapable. They're consistent, they're persistent, they're over time, right? These things are happening. And maybe it isn't one big thing like a car accident or something like that. But we're talking about these things that are grating away at your sense of autonomy and safety and stability that you're unable to escape from. And so she, when she gives examples of this, she talks about things like, being taken captive or kidnapped, living in a country that is constantly at war or with terrorism, cults, which a lot of religion, like a fundamentalist, high control religion fits into that, and also domestic violence. And so then when we look at Judith Herman's work, which was so pioneering and still such a wonderful foundation for how we view trauma now, she really dug into like, hey, it's not just these things, these big things that happen like that the DSM talks about. It's all these other things too. And I don't know what your thoughts are about this, Andrew, but there was a term or some terms that used to float around called like big T trauma, small T trauma. I personally hate those. And they said, big T traumas are like your car accidents, your wars, like things like that are described in the DSM. And then your small T traumas are going to be bullying, significant distress in all these different situations. But what happens when we use that language is we automatically compare. And we also say like, okay, so if I have this big T trauma thing happen to me, then I should be able to prescribe the outcome. I'll deal with this and this and this and this, and that will absolutely happen. And then if it's small T trauma, I can prescribe the outcome and it's going to look like this in my body, in my life, in my relationships. The problem happens when somebody has the big T trauma and they don't respond in that way, right. Or somebody has the little T trauma and they respond in the big T trauma way. Well, then does that mean I'm wrong? Does that mean I'm hiding something? Am I over like inflating my reactions? Am I, for the person who was at war and isn't really impacted, am I denying it, numbing it out, dissociating? It's very confusing. So I don't like those terms because of the comparison piece, and that invites a lot of shame. But I think it's important to recognize, going back to what we said, like religious trauma is trauma and trauma is trauma, right? And so it's all about how it lives in your body. So maybe you had a series of what we might call smaller things happen, but they're impacting your body the same way a quote unquote bigger thing would. I think it's so important to just let our experiences be what they are, notice how they're showing up in our bodies. And that's what helps us determine if they're trauma rather than what actually happened.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I've often felt like the big T, little T trauma debate kind of played right into the same that same reductionist framework the DSM took, where it was like, it's reducing what trauma actually is. It's like it's like quantifying it. Like, well, if this was your experience, this should be like this was what your traumatic event was. This is what it should be looking like. Well, except for all the cases that's not what it looks like.
Right. Yeah.
And how
Yeah.
invalidating and disorienting for folks who are not responding the clinically prescribed way. It's like,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I agree completely.
I don't know about you, but I know for me, I want to hear your thoughts. Like I have a lot of clients that will say, oh, but this thing didn't happen to me. So like I wasn't abused by a clergy member. I didn't, have to deal with this crazy altar call situation, or I didn't have to go on a mission or whatever. So I didn't have the thing happen, but my body is still reacting in these ways that would perhaps indicate trauma. And maybe I feel a certain way. Maybe that's a lot of shame or something. I don't know. Is that something you've heard from your clients before? I call that complex trauma. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's the woke because the way it's showing up physiologically, I looks like trauma.
Yeah.
and if it's like, it's kind of like, if it looks like trauma, feels like trauma, shows up like trauma, until I see evidence to the contrary, it sounds like trauma. So it must be trauma.
Yeah.
I can say just anecdotally that I don't know that I've ever worked with someone who has trauma that did not at some point compare to somebody else who had it worse.
I think that's so true. Yeah.
I think that's one thing I've consistently seen from everyone. It's like, well, like I'm struggling with what I'm struggling with, but like, at least this didn't happen, or my sister had this happen to her and I didn't have that. So at least that was good for me. But yeah, I don't know. I think, and I don't know how officially of a trait of trauma, being a survivor of trauma that is, but I do see that very consistently, regardless of what the trauma stemmed from, regardless of the context.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Judith Herman's assessment of like cults tending to be a place where a lot of complex trauma is born from. And I know that some people don't like to use the word cult as interchangeable with like high control religion. So I want to make space for that. And yet I also look at the dynamics of power and control that are present in cults and present in high control religion. There's a lot of overlap, and maybe that's a different conversation for a different day. But yeah, I have lots of people who are like, yeah, the thing didn't happen, or this person had it worse, or, whatever. And it really is, I think having a solid understanding of trauma is so important. I mean, even yesterday in a conversation with a friend of mine who is like, yeah, but I didn't have this thing happen. And I was like, yeah, I know, but your body is literally responding the same way like a sexual assault survivor would respond. That tells me that even though you didn't have that physical experience, those messages, in this case from purity culture, are living in your body the same way. And you're responding as if that thing is happening, and that is trauma. And I think to destigmatize a bit, like what trauma is, people are like, oh, I don't, that's not me. And to just say like, you didn't have control over that. Like the thing that happened to you, like if you had a choice, you probably would not have like stayed in that situation. But like, I think it's so important to just say like, it doesn't have to be this big thing. Like having an appropriate understanding of what trauma is really helps us then like normalize and organize our own experiences and get the help that we need. That's important for us. And that's something I'm so passionate about, is like letting people know like, no, it doesn't have to be this one thing. And that means you have religious trauma. It's so many of us that this persistent, consistent over time thing. And it's now we're living in the impact of it, in the aftermath. I mean, so I wonder, like, how do you, when you have clients or friends or whatnot, I get this question a lot too, like, how do I know if I have religious trauma? How would you answer that?
I would, the way I answer that is I honestly will say, let's not worry about the label so much, but I'm curious about your experience. Like, I want to know, what was it like? I mean, regardless of whether we call it trauma or not, just put that on the back burner, put a pin in it, but let's not worry about that. And just simply, obviously it was distressing. Like I just validate like what you went through sounds like it was really hard and it really sucked and you didn't have anybody supporting you. And then so curiosity and compassion and just diving into that. And then it usually and then the question does usually answer itself pretty quickly. But like, I really just like, let's not worry about that intellectual debate of, is this trauma or is it not? And just hear what it was like to go through what you went through and what you're still are going through.
I love that. That's such a compassionate answer. And it's such a compassionate way of looking at it too, because I mean, I think as humans, we do want a label or a diagnosis that does help us organize things. I mean, I've said that about my own
Yeah.
experience, but yeah, being curious about, well, what is your experience feels like, even as you said that, my whole body was like, oh, like kind of like there was like this ability to like sit back and take a breath instead of that like desperate energy of like, I have to figure this out right now. Give me a checklist. Do I have religious trauma or not? Because I get caught in that too. Like people ask me that, you know, when I've been on other podcasts, like, how do we know? And I always want to come up with this like list of like 10 things, but it's like, no, because you know, how trauma kind of looks in each of us, like, or how we externalize it might be a little bit different in each of us, even though it lives in our body in a similar way, like with the nervous system. For you, that might look like anxiety and or depression, but for me, it might look like extreme relational difficulties or gastrointestinal issues, right? There's a whole bunch of different things when we have unprocessed or unresolved trauma. It can look a lot of different ways. It can look like hypervigilance. It can look like social phobias. It can look like codependency or lack of boundaries in relationship or being unable to like use your voice. It can look like a whole variety of different things. And so there's no exhaustive list, but I think to your point, Andrew, of like, we just need to be curious. What is your actual experience? And then we can help you go like, yeah, that kind of fits with all of this. It might suggest that we are dealing with some trauma here. I think that's so important.
Yeah, I've and to be, not to get too far ahead of myself, but like what I use, the modality I use specifically is called internal family systems parts work.
Yeah.
For those who are familiar with it, and for any folks I've worked with who are listening, you probably hear me say curiosity and compassion so much. You're like, you know, probably sick of it. And yet it is so much the crux of these things, because
it is. Yeah.
You know, it's easy to kind of get in this rational cognitive framework of like, well, is this trauma or not? And then what do I do with it? But, you know, one thing I've said before, it's like, you know, whether you want to label it as trauma or not, the fact of the matter is there's a part of you that it was traumatizing. It was hard. That part is struggling. And like, I want to just validate that part of you, whether that's the entirety of your experience or not. Cause I recognize there's other parts that feel shame. They're like, no, it wasn't trauma. I'm stronger than that. That wasn't me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And we can work with those parts too. But there is part of you that absolutely, like, the fact that you're here, the fact that you're asking the question, and the fact that I'm hearing the story, and I'm hearing all of these things, like, you know, like that was trauma. That was that part was traumatized, even if there are other parts that maybe weren't. Yeah. And again, the complexity of parts work helps. I don't need to take us down that rabbit hole just yet, but it's very, very helpful as well with doing any sort of trauma work.
Big fan of internal family systems. In fact, when I started my own professional like journey, right, like as a therapist, I worked in community mental health, which I know you have some experience into. And so there's a lot of limitations around like modalities that you use and everything. And so whenever I quit and went into private practice and actually started there, like doing my own work or whatever, internal family systems was the modality that I really honed in on personally and professionally. And I have to say, it was one of the most transformative things for me. And I still weave it into all of my work. There's something about that in religious trauma that works really well together. So maybe someday we'll get into a conversation about that a little bit more.
Put a pin in that and revisit it.
Yes. Yeah. So to just kind of wrap that piece up of like, you know, how do I know if I have religious trauma? You know, like if you need a list or something like that, I would probably encourage people to look up symptoms of complex PTSD or complex trauma and just kind of loosely hold that and say, how might that fit into my experiences? So when it talks about like emotional distress or relational, struggles within relationships, can I kind of hold that as like a framework over my life and see like, does that fit? Does that not fit? And that does not mean that you do or do not have like complex trauma. It just might be a little bit more information. If you don't have like a support person, say a therapist or a coach or something that is already helping you kind of in that journey, or maybe we don't have the resources for that or the time for that, whatever it is, that would be, I'd say, if you wanted like maybe look up like complex trauma and see that, but the compassion and curiosity, I'm a big fan of that too. And like really just being observatory of our experiences and going, wow, like, that might not be what other people have experienced before. And I might need to be curious about that.
Yeah.
So, oh, sorry. Don't want to cut you off.
Oh, no, you're good. No, I was wait. I'm waiting with bated breath. I was like, you're going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to move on to the next thing that we were going to talk about was just like, what is the difference between like church hurt and religious trauma? I'd be curious to know what you think.
Yeah. Well, my take on church hurt is that usually that is a phrase used by people still within the institution of the church.
Yes.
To try to diminish whatever we're talking about when it comes to, different. Anyway, so that is, I realize that's a little more of a cynical and perhaps argumentative take on that. The thing with religious trauma is like, I do often see folks try to, when people are talking about harm that occurred to them within the framework of the church, whatever denomination that is, whatever. Usually I've just seen church hurt be used in a way that's trying to invalidate. Not saying that's always how it's used, because I don't know that I've seen any kind of a consensus on a working definition of what church hurt means, but that's anecdotally usually the context I see it used in.
Yeah.
But I don't know. What is your experience with that term?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, because I have this book that's coming out and it's called When Religion Hurts You. So it's similar. And part of the reason for that title is that it's just that, right? And the subtitle talks about, religious trauma, right? And the impact of high control religion. But it's this idea of, I mean, I've heard that so many times of like, oh, it's church hurt. People are sinners. God is not, so they're gonna hurt you. So it's almost like a justification explanation type thing. And yet I could take it at like a totally like literary view and be like, church hurt means you were hurt in or by the church. Right. So
right.
Kind of depends on the context, but I tend to agree with you in terms of like how I don't really use that term much, but I would welcome it if somebody used it with me. I also sometimes wonder if people use terms like church hurt to describe situations that perhaps did not result in trauma, but were very hurtful. And I think we'll talk about this in a future episode when we're talking about spiritual abuse and adverse religious experiences. But I think it would be important to note that we can have experiences of overwhelm and even abuse and distress in religious contexts that do not necessarily result in trauma, but do have an impact on us. And so I think maybe I'm looking at that question that I asked, difference between church hurt and religious trauma, also from that perspective of saying there can be a lot of hurt and or harm or abuse or adversity that comes out of religious experiences or institutions or relationships. And it may not result in trauma, but it is impactful and it is something that recovery from is needed. And so I think that's important to acknowledge too, even if that hurt or abuse or whatever didn't result in trauma, it doesn't invalidate the impact of it, both in the moment as well as after and the healing that needs to happen. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, this is in the religious context, but yeah, I've definitely frequently said that, like everything that is emotionally distressing is not necessarily trauma. Or does not result in trauma, I should say.
Yes.
But that does not mean that it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that it didn't impact you. It doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve attention and so forth. So I mean, the same idea, just in the religious context.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can think of a lot of experiences, messages, doctrine, or whatever that were profoundly negatively impactful on me, but I wouldn't consider them traumatic for me. Whereas other things, absolutely, I would, and that, again, that's very subjective, right? So what that was for me may or may not be for you and vice versa. But I think it's important to acknowledge all that. I really appreciate what you said, just that, emotional like distress does not automatically equal this end result. And that's important because especially when we're looking at like validating the experiences that we've had, we've already talked about, and we actually didn't talk about this, and maybe we should, is like, it's very common for people to come out of these fundamentalist groups and feel very isolated. Like I'm the only one who's ever gone through this. I don't know where to get help. I don't even know if I need to get help. Maybe this is just a me thing, right? And they come in contact with people or professionals that don't know about religious trauma, that it's a thing, that it's not just a quote unquote bad church experience. And so I think like being able to have like this platform or the work that we do to be able to validate their experiences and help them realize, okay, this does seem to be showing up as trauma for you, or this doesn't, but it still is impactful for you. I think that's so necessary, because we need more people who can understand that, because there is such a large group of people who are coming out of these high control religions and groups and cults that are deeply in pain and not sure how to carry on with their life. And they're meeting therapists and clinicians and practitioners that have no idea what they're talking about and don't know how to help them. And that's, to me, I mean, that's the whole reason why the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery was like created, was because of that need. But I think it's important to just acknowledge that like your experiences are valid, like they're valid in the sense that they happened and there's an impact, and you deserve to have support for that. And at the very least, know that it's real. That's another soapbox, right? We got so many soapboxes.
Just like stack them in the corner and we'll get to them. We'll get to them accordingly
at some point. So what do we do? Like if you have religious trauma, if I have religious trauma, if one of our clients has religious trauma, like what do we do?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because I think that so often the one size fits all answer people say is, oh, do therapy, which is great, unless you can't afford it.
Yeah. Or unless you can't find a therapist who knows about this stuff.
That too. Exactly. And so, while I do think that's a great thing to do, I do think there are other things that one can do. I mean, for example, like there are resources, lots of social media resources, but like what I do, internal family systems parts work. To give a very concrete example, there's a book called No Bad Parts by Dr. Richard Schwartz. And that's actually a really accessible, it's not a clinical manual. It's a very good jumping off point for someone who's just trying to maybe get started with something, but doesn't have the time or the money to like really jump into like therapy or something, or can't find a therapist, for example. That's just one example. I mean, honestly, I really think that the power of community and social, like on social media platforms, has actually been pretty amazing. I mean, self-disclosure for those who don't know this about me. I mean, that's how I met you. That's how I am involved now with the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. It's like, what if it were not for Instagram, I would not even know about CTRR, nor would I know you. Yeah, and so
exactly.
So not only is it just a friendship and a professional connection, but also it has been very helpful on my own path of unpacking and processing my own religious trauma and all the baggage therein. You know, it's been really, really helpful, the different folks I've connected with. So, you know, I would encourage that as well.
Yeah. Oh, I 1,000% agree. You know, I said earlier, you know, I've been deconstructed. I don't know. It's always a process, right? For like, I think 15, 17 years. Social media was not around back then. I literally thought that I was the only one who is going through this, not in like a narcissistic way, just in like a very isolated way. I had no idea. And so even though I'd done a lot of my deconstructing prior to social media really taking off and whatever, whenever like Twitter and Instagram especially came on the scene and people started talking about this, it was a whole other level of healing that I experienced simply because of the connection and the community that was available. People were talking about it. They were putting words and phrases to things I had experienced. And in some ways that was really overwhelming, because it was like, oh, I'm like peeling all these layers back again. But in most ways it was very healing. And so, yeah, to your point, I think, you know, sometimes social media can be like a cesspool of awfulness. And other times, you know, like I think about the people I get to work with and the people I get to talk to and every day. And I'm that is thanks to social media, like 100%. I'm very grateful. And I don't think I would be who I am today without this as a resource. And so, like to that question, what do? I think social media can be a really great place to start, whether it's just looking up different terms of, deconstruction, deconversion, religious trauma, adverse religious experiences, see what people are posting. But then there's also access to community and resources and books and podcasts and all these things, and take advantage of it, like as it feels okay to you. So I agree with you, Andrew, in the sense of like, in a perfect world, everybody would be able to have access to a trauma-informed and trauma-trained therapist or coach or practitioner who can speak to your unique needs and do it at the low price of $1.99. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
That would be ideal. But for a variety of reasons, that's not where we're at individually or, collectively as a country. And so, looking for resources that fit for you, I think is so important. And honestly, that is why this podcast is existing, why we're doing this podcast. I think both of us saw this need. There's some excellent deconstruction podcasts of like people talking about their stories of coming out of different religions and cults and groups and faith systems. And there's some really great podcasts out there. And there's also like really great podcasts that talk about trauma and other mental health issues, but there's not really any podcasts that talk about religious trauma specifically. And how do we resolve and recover from that? And what are some of the unique pieces? We talked at the front of like the word religious being like a bit of an adjective that helps us understand the context for where this trauma took place. And so we wanted to be able to provide a resource that really spoke to that said, hey, this isn't necessarily about deconstructing and like how awful the church was or how awful this person was. Like, we care about your stories, but we're going to focus on what does the healing piece look like? Like, if you're coming out of a high control religion, what are things that are maybe more unique to people coming out of high control religion to heal from and through? And we want to be able to provide resources, both professional and lived experiences, so that people can feel like they aren't alone and that they do have resources and that, there's other people like them, essentially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the biggest things I've seen in just trauma healing in general, one of the biggest things that I think gets in the way of that is isolation or the perception of being isolated. And so I think just to the whole big picture of like, the purpose of this podcast, like creating community and connection and validation and helping people realize that you are not in fact alone.
Yeah.
I get asked that actually quite a bit. Like someone they give me an anecdote of something they're going through, and they're like, like, is that just me or are other people, and of course, confidentiality, I can't tell them what else other folks are necessarily going through, but I can say, not the first time. You are not alone.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. I can assure you that you are in good company.
Yeah.
Like, this is a question. And the concern of, am I the only one, is also a question I get asked a lot.
Yeah. It's so nice to know that we're not the only ones.
Yeah.
And, I think I can speak on behalf of both of us. Like, part of the joy of doing something like this is we have the lived experience, as you all heard, we also have the professional side where we've done school and certifications and trauma resolution programs. And our hope is to be able to bring that together to like give that to whoever is listening, and know that you're not alone, that you're part of this community of, Black sheep, Sunday school dropouts, who we're just trying
school dropouts.
There we go. Sabbath school. Yes, exactly. And there's a bunch of us out there.
All right. So our next segment is called Taking Back Sundays. And this is just the part where we like to talk about some of the things that we are reclaiming. Maybe reclaiming like something that perhaps we lost, or maybe never really had in the first place due to fundamentalism and such. So I'll start with you, Laura. What are some things that you're reclaiming in your life these days?
Yeah, this actually relates a little bit to the resource that I talked about earlier for myself. I recently had a hysterectomy, and that's probably something I'll share more about at a different time, and going through a pretty extensive recovery process as a result. I was basically like laid out in bed for about 6 weeks, doing nothing, literally nothing. Did not watch TV, did not read, did not listen to podcasts. And I realized like how much my body needed it to just literally focus on healing. That was it. That's all I did. And it showed me how much I push myself, like with energy I don't have, where I stress myself out, where I put expectations on myself, where I grind and grind and grind. And it really like, I couldn't unsee the unsustainability of my pace of life and, you know, how fast I move and how many things I do, and really challenged me to kind of take back a slower pace and not have to produce so much and give myself time to rest and really listen to my body. There was a point in my recovery where my surgeon had originally told me, oh, you can go back to work at this many weeks recovery. And so I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I tried. And it did not work. And my body was screaming a big, big no. And I remember having this moment where I sat on my bed and I said, this is what I teach to my clients every day, to listen to your body, to honor the requests of your body. And if I don't do this, I'm the biggest hypocrite ever. But there's risk, right? Because that meant I had to cancel 3 weeks worth of sessions. It meant that, put me in some different spaces financially and all these different things. But I was like, I have to practice what I preach and I have to listen to my body. And I feel like it's been this reclamation process of rest and slowing down and being present and listening to my body and trusting that when I do that, my body will heal, my body will take care of me, and everything will be okay. Even though okay is very subjective, it might not be the thing I thought it was, but it will turn out okay, And so, yeah, I think that's probably where I'm at the most. Like what I'm reclaiming is embodiment. It is rest. It is slowing down. And that feels very different from many other times in my life, including religion, where I was just constantly on the go. So yeah, that's what I'm reclaiming. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's amazing. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so for me, it's, this is going to sound interesting because on the one hand, what I'm about to say is going to sound like it's the opposite of what I'm reclaiming is by doing more, but there's layers to it. I'm not actually, my background is a Seventh-day Adventist, Saturday Sabbath keeping. And for a Seventh-day Adventist, it's not as simple as just going to church on Saturday morning. It's like you keep the Sabbath, and just like and just like in, as what we call the Old Testament, but Jewish scriptures, like it's sundown to sundown, Friday night to Saturday night. That is the Sabbath. And that is, so growing up, like, no television, no computer games, video games. Like usually we would do something out in nature as a family, which sounds nice now that I'm an adult. But at the time when I wanted to just be hanging out at home, watching cartoons, hated it. Anyway, fast forward, some of the reclaiming, I work most of my clients I see during the week. I do see a few folks Saturday morning, and Saturday morning specifically. 2 reasons. One, I don't actually want to have a full day on Saturday. However, at the same time, there's something really cathartic and reclaiming kind of
I love that.
Actually seeing folks Saturday morning when I'll sometimes I'll go into the clock and I'll see 11:30. I'm like, yeah. So like right now, those churches I grew up in, the sermon's getting started. People are all in the sanctuary. I'm not there anymore, but I'm doing this, and I'm actually working with folks who are recovering from some kind of various religious trauma and different. And it's even more meaningful and cool when it is like someone who was also a Sabbath keeper once and was doing the same thing. I mean, it's just because it's that literal time and space in the world that, the idea was that it's for rest. But the fact is, it was the way it was presented to most of us who grew up in Adventism. It was such a burden. And so reclaiming that and doing something with that is direct opposition to the burden that was placed on a lot of us is really cool.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It's so cool to like the different ways that we can reclaim and take back different portions of our lives,
Yeah.
that we had lost or maybe not even had in the first place. And so I
Yeah.
love that you see clients on Saturday morning for
Yeah.
that reason.
Yeah. It's actually intentional. I kind of like it.
Yeah.
I like
I
it.
like that's great. That's so cool. Well, I think that wraps us up for our very first episode. We're so glad that if you stuck with us this long, it's just a joy to be able to provide a resource like this, and it's fun to do this with you too. So you can find us on social media platforms at Sunday School Dropout Pod, and we would love, love, love if you would go to our website, which is SundaySchoolDropoutPod.com, and sign up for our list. You can find me at Dr. Laura E. Anderson across all platforms, including my website. Andrew, where can we find you?
Yeah. So you can find me at deconstruct_everything on Instagram. And I think I'm the same name on TikTok. Pretty
I
sure it's
love
the
it.
same.
I
I
love
think
it.
it's the same on both Instagram and TikTok. I am on Twitter. I'm sorry, I don't remember my handle, but you could probably
Yeah.
search the same thing and you could probably find me. But
Yes. And this is a podcast brought to you by the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. If you're looking for support, whether that's individual, family, couples, or group support, you can go to traumaresolutionandrecovery.com or find us on Instagram, Trauma Resolution and Recovery. So thank you so much for worshiping
yeah.
with us today.
Thank you.
Yes.
This has been nice. Very nice.
Yes. Yes. And be blessed.
Be blessed.